My friend, you've watched the highlight reels. You've seen the number roll across the screen, £80 million, and you've felt that little flicker of awe. But nobody ever shows you what happens after the cameras leave. Tonight, I'm going to show you the part of the story football doesn't put in the reel. The part where the money disappears, the phone stops ringing, and a man who once filled stadiums ends up sleeping in the back seat of his own car. You already suspect something, don't you? You've watched enough of these stories to know that the official version is never the whole version. A player retires. There's a testimonial, a few kind words from a pundit. And then silence. No follow-up, no accountability, no one asking the question that actually matters. Where did all that money go, and who was supposed to be protecting it? Here's what almost nobody says out loud. Football doesn't just risk a player's body, it risks his entire financial future, and it does so by design. The clubs are protected, the agents are protected. The academies that discovered him, the leagues that profited from him, all protected. The player is the only person in the entire chain with no safety net. We're going to call our subject Danny, not because his real name doesn't matter, but because his story isn't really about one man. It's about a machine that has quietly ruined hundreds of men just like him, and dressed it up as personal failure every single time. Danny grew up in a two-bedroom flat above a laundrette. His mother worked nights, his father wasn't around. Football wasn't a hobby for Danny. It was the only door in the building that wasn't locked. At 16, a scout saw him destroy a Sunday league match on a pitch with more mud than grass. By 19, he was starting for a Premier League club. By 23, he was earning more in a single week than his mother had earned in the last decade of her life. And my friend, here's where I need you to really sit with something. Nobody prepared him for this. Not the club, not the academy, not the system that had spent 7 years training his left foot and precisely 0 hours training his relationship with money. Think about that for a second. A boy is handed more wealth at 23 than most people see in a lifetime, and the institution that made him rich has no legal, financial, or moral obligation to teach him what to do with it. That obligation, quietly and conveniently, falls to the agent. This is where the story stops being about Danny and starts being about the machine underneath him. Danny's agent took 15% of every deal. Standard, they told him. What wasn't standard was where the agent then pointed him. Toward a trusted financial advisor who specialized in something called film partnership tax schemes. You've probably never heard of these. That's the point. They were sold to dozens of footballers in the 2000s and early 2010s as a legal way to shelter income from tax. In reality, many of them were later ruled unlawful by tax authorities, leaving players with retroactive bills worth millions, years after the money was already spent. Danny didn't understand the paperwork. Why would he? He was 24, training 6 days a week, and trusting the adults in the room who told him this was normal, that everyone at his level did this. By the time he was 29, a serious knee injury ended his career 2 years earlier than expected. The club moved on within a season. The sponsorship deals evaporated, and the tax bill, the one nobody explained properly, arrived at exactly the moment his income did not. Here's the quiet cruelty of it, my friend. The system that built him up in 18 months could unbuild him in 18 months too. And it did. We talk about money like it's an abstraction. Numbers on a screen. But watch what it actually does to a person when it disappears. Danny sold the house first, then the second car, then the watches, the ones he'd bought not because he particularly wanted them, but because buying them was what you did when you were a Premier League footballer, because everyone around him was doing it, because for years nobody told him that lifestyle inflation was its own kind of injury, just a slower one. The marriage didn't survive the stress. Most don't in these stories. Research from player welfare organizations has found that within 5 years of retiring, a striking number of professional footballers face serious financial trouble. And it is very rarely because they were reckless. It's because nobody built them a bridge from the pitch to the rest of their life. Danny ended up living out of a car for a period of roughly 3 years. Not because he'd gambled it away in some tabloid fantasy, because a machine had extracted value from his body for a decade, mismanaged what it generated, and then discarded him the moment he stopped producing. Doesn't that make you angry? It should, because this isn't a story about one man's bad decisions. It's a story about an entire industry that treats young men as assets to be optimized, not people to be protected. Let's talk about who actually had the power to stop this and didn't. The club's new academy graduates were being funneled toward the same handful of financial advisors. The league's new retired players were disproportionately ending up bankrupt, homeless, or worse. Some studies point to alarmingly high rates of mental health crises among retired professionals. The football authorities had decades of data showing this exact pattern, repeating career after career, generation after generation. And what changed? Some voluntary financial education seminars, some hotlines, helpful but optional, bolted onto a system that was never redesigned to actually protect the people inside it. Here's the uncomfortable truth, my friend. The sport doesn't actually need to fix this. The talent pipeline never runs dry. There is always another 16-year-old on a muddy pitch somewhere, ready to be discovered, ready to be told he's found the golden ticket, ready to sign whatever's put in front of him. The machine doesn't need Danny to survive, it just needs the next Danny to show up. That's not conspiracy, that's just incentive. And incentive unexamined becomes cruelty. There's a moment, and this is the part of Danny's story that stays with you, where he described sitting in that car outside a petrol station at 2 in the morning, watching a highlight reel of himself on his phone. His own goal celebration, thousands of strangers cheering a version of him that no longer existed. He said it didn't feel like watching himself, it felt like watching someone the system had already finished using. Sit with that for a second. A man alone in the cold, watching footage of the very moment his life was supposedly at its best, and feeling nothing but distance from it. That's not a footballer failing football. That's football failing a footballer and calling it his fault, so nobody else has to answer for it. So where does that leave us, my friend? I don't think this story is really about £80 million. I think it's about what we choose to call personal responsibility when it's actually institutional neglect. It's easier for a league, a club, an agent to let the headline read "Footballer blows fortune" than to ask why an 18-year-old was ever left alone with financial decisions no first-year professional in any other industry would be trusted to make unsupervised. Danny eventually rebuilt something. Not the mansion, not the watches, something smaller and, by his own account, more honest. He now spends time warning younger players about exactly the kind of trusted advisors that quietly took his money in the first place. Not because it's redemptive television, because somebody has to, and almost nobody with real influence in the game is willing to. That, to me, is the real story, not the fall. The fact that the fall was preventable and the system chose not to prevent it. For him and for every player who came before and after him. If this story made you angry, good. That anger is appropriate. It means you're seeing the machine clearly, maybe for the first time. I want to know from you, do you think football clubs and leagues have a real responsibility to protect players financially after their careers end? Or is that asking too much of an industry built to move on the moment the whistle blows? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if you're the kind of person who wants the version of football history nobody else is willing to tell you, the buried stories, the quiet failures, the human cost behind the headlines, stay with me. Subscribe and I'll keep telling you the truth this sport would rather you forget.